Millionaire woman brings black manservant to an exclusive party to mock him, but everyone falls in love with him. Intended as the subject of scorn, he instead charms the elite crowd. His charisma changes the atmosphere, leaving her plans in disarray. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The Manhattan skyline casts long shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Madison Wells' penthouse apartment. Her reflection bounced off every mirrored surface of the master suite as she examined herself from multiple angles. 3 stylists hovered around her like worker bees, adjusting the hem of her custom-made Valentino dress. "Sarah, the left side needs to be higher," Madison commanded, not bothering to look at the stylist directly. "I need to be perfect tonight." Her fingers traced the diamond necklace at her throat, a Wells family heirloom worth more than most people's homes. Blake Morton, her closest confidant and fellow Upper East Side socialite, lounged on the Italian leather chaise, scrolling through his phone. "Tell me again why you invited the help to tonight's gala?" He glanced up, a perfectly manicured eyebrow raised in question. Madison's red lips curved into a calculated smile. "Because, darling, sometimes you need to remind people of their place in the world. Jamal's gotten too comfortable lately. Did you know he actually suggested changes to the building's maintenance schedule?" She scoffed, checking her reflection again, as if he knows better than management. In another part of the city, Jamal Richardson stood in his modest Bronx apartment, adjusting a borrowed charcoal gray Hugo Boss suit. His friend Marcus, who worked at a high-end menswear store, had pulled strings to loan it to him for the evening. The suit fit well enough, though the shoulders were slightly tight. Jamal's reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a man both confident and wary. His phone buzzed with a text from his sister. "You sure about this? Rich people parties never end well for folks like us." Jamal typed back, "Someone needs to show them we're more than their stereotypes." He tucked the phone away and straightened his tie, remembering the smirk on Madison's face when she'd handed him the invitation 3 days ago. "We'd love to have you attend," she'd said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "After all, you're practically part of the family now." The other maintenance workers had looked away, embarrassed for him. Back in the penthouse, Madison's preparation continued. Her friend Vanessa arrived, carrying a glass of champagne. "The group chat is buzzing about your little social experiment," she said, settling onto the bed. "Everyone's dying to see how this plays out." "It's hardly an experiment," Madison replied, dismissing the last stylist with a wave. "It's a lesson. These people who work for us, they need to understand there's a natural order." Jamal's been getting ideas lately, talking about community initiatives and suggesting improvements like he has any real understanding of our world. "And you're sure this won't backfire?" Blake asked, finally putting his phone down. "He is rather charming. Remember how he handled that crisis with the Thompson's water leak?" Madison turned sharply. "Charm only gets you so far. Once he's surrounded by our world, the art, the conversation, the subtle social cues, he'll be completely out of his depth. Trust me, by the end of tonight, he'll never forget where he belongs." In the service elevator of Madison's building, Jamal checked his watch. The invitation said 8 p.m., and he believed in punctuality. He could hear the music starting above, the soft drift of classical strings mixing with the mechanical hum of the elevator. A maintenance worker he knew, Carlos, stopped him before he reached the penthouse level. "Hey man, you don't have to do this. Everyone knows it's a setup." Jamal adjusted his cuffs, a small smile playing on his lips. "Sometimes, Carlos, you have to play the game to change the rules." Madison gathered her inner circle in the penthouse's grand foyer, champagne flutes in hand. "Remember," she instructed, her voice low and precise. "Let him try to fit in. Let him think he's succeeding. Then, when the moment's right, we'll show him exactly how out of place he really is." The first guests were arriving now, their voices echoing through the marble entrance. Madison took her position by the door, playing the gracious hostess while her heart raced with anticipation. Everything was perfectly arranged, the lighting, the music, the guest list. Tonight would be a masterclass in social warfare, and Jamal wouldn't even see it coming. What Madison didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that her carefully laid plans were about to unravel in ways she never imagined, starting with the moment Jamal would step through those doors. The gala transformed Madison's penthouse into a glittering showcase of wealth and status. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across the marble floors, while waiters in crisp black uniforms weaved through clusters of New York's elite, offering champagne and canapes on silver trays. The guest list read like a who's who of Manhattan society. Hedge fund managers, art dealers, old money families, and rising stars of various industries. Linda Ashworth, the notorious society columnist, circulated through the crowd with her phone, discreetly recording every detail. "Madison has outdone herself," she murmured to a small group near the bar. "The Monet in the dining room is new. Must have cost north of 8 figures." Madison stood at the center of it all, wearing confidence like armor. Her dress caught the light with every movement, and she positioned herself perfectly to monitor the entrance while appearing casually engaged in conversation with important guests. The police commissioner's wife was mid-sentence when Jamal arrived. The entire room seemed to inhale at once. Jamal stood in the doorway, and for a moment, no one moved. He wore the borrowed Hugo Boss suit like it had been tailored for him, his posture straight but relaxed. The slight imperfection of the fit somehow made him appear more genuine rather than less polished. Madison's champagne glass froze halfway to her lips. This wasn't the Jamal she saw in work clothes, dealing with building maintenance. This man commanded attention without demanding it. "Is that really the maintenance supervisor?" someone whispered. "He looks like he could be on the board of directors." Jamal took one step forward, then another. The crowd unconsciously parted, creating a path. Madison felt her carefully constructed plan starting to slip. She'd expected him to stumble in, obviously out of place, perhaps even wearing something inappropriate. Instead, he moved with an ease that made several guests straighten their own postures in response. "Good evening," Jamal said, his voice carrying just enough to be heard without seeming forceful. He smiled, not the servile smile of an employee, but the warm, confident expression of someone who belonged exactly where he was. "Madison, thank you for the invitation. The space looks transformed. Though I must say, the lighting you chose perfectly highlights the architectural features we discussed last month." Several guests nodded appreciatively, looking up at the subtle spotlighting that, indeed, drew attention to the room's elegant bones. Madison felt her cheeks warm. She hadn't expected him to notice, let alone comment intelligently on, the design choices. "Jamal," she managed, her voice almost steady. "How nice of you to come." He moved through the space with unexpected grace, stopping to admire a sculpture near the window. Lauren Davies, the Met's junior curator, was already drifting in his direction, intrigue written across her face. "The Giacometti?" Jamal said, gesturing to the piece. "It's positioned perfectly. Why to catch the evening light?" Though I've always found it interesting how his work speaks to the isolation of urban life, especially relevant in buildings like this one. Lauren's eyebrows shot up with interest. Madison watched in horror as a small group began to form around them, drawn into the discussion. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Jamal was meant to stand awkwardly alone, trying too hard to join conversations, making social mistakes that would highlight the gap between his world and theirs. Instead, he was becoming the center of gravity in the room. Even Blake, traitor that he was, had drifted over to join the growing circle around Jamal. "Get it under control," Vanessa hissed in Madison's ear. "He's stealing your show." Madison forced a smile and moved to intervene, but Jamal was already sharing an anecdote that had his listeners leaning in closer. "The thing about art in public spaces," he was saying, "is that it belongs to everyone who experiences it. Working in this building, I've seen how different people interact with these pieces every day. There's a whole story there that often gets overlooked." The police commissioner's wife nodded enthusiastically. "What a fascinating perspective. Madison, you never told us your staff was so culturally aware." Madison's smile tightened. The night was young, she reminded herself. There would be plenty of opportunities to put Jamal in his place. But watching him charm her carefully curated guest list with his unexpected knowledge and natural charisma, she felt the first real flicker of doubt. The game she'd planned to play was quickly becoming more complex than she'd anticipated, and she wasn't entirely sure she remembered the rules. Madison retreated to the bar, ordering a martini stronger than her usual preference. From this vantage point, she watched her carefully orchestrated evening crumble. Jamal had somehow become the focal point of her party, and worse, he seemed completely unaware of how thoroughly he was disrupting her plans. "I can't believe he actually knows what he's talking about," Blake whispered, appearing at her side. "Did you know he had an art history background?" "He doesn't," Madison snapped, though uncertainty crept into her voice. She realized she knew almost nothing about Jamal's background, despite him working in her building for the past 2 years. Across the room, Lauren Davies had completely abandoned her usual aloof demeanor. The Met curator, known for reducing artists to tears with her critiques, was actually laughing at something Jamal had said about modern architecture's influence on contemporary sculpture. "Tell me more about your perspective on urban spaces," Lauren said, her voice carrying across the room. "It's refreshing to hear from someone who sees art living and breathing in its environment, rather than just hanging on walls." Madison knocked back her martini and moved closer, positioning herself within earshot. A small crowd had gathered around Jamal and Lauren, including several key art world figures she'd spent months cultivating relationships with. "Well," Jamal began, his voice warm but measured, "working in buildings like this, you see how art and architecture shape people's daily experiences. Take that Rothko piece." He gestured to a painting Madison had recently acquired. "It's not just about the color field theory everyone studies in school. It's about how the security guard stops to look at it during his night rounds, or how the morning light hits it differently than the evening light." Lauren nodded enthusiastically. "You're talking about democratizing art appreciation, breaking down the artificial barriers between high culture and lived experience." "Exactly," Jamal smiled, "though I suspect some people prefer keeping those barriers firmly in place." Several guests shifted uncomfortably, aware of the subtle challenge in his words. Madison felt her face grow hot. Was he actually calling out the social hierarchy right here in her home? She stepped forward, trying to redirect the conversation. "Speaking of barriers, has everyone seen the new installation in the garden? The artist is quite exclusive." "Madison," Lauren interrupted, barely glancing her way, "your maintenance supervisor has just offered one of the most insightful critiques of modern art accessibility I've heard in years. Did you know about his background in urban studies?" Madison froze. Well, of course, we value all our employees' diverse experiences." "Urban studies?" Another guest chimed in. "Where did you study?" "City College," Jamal answered simply, without a trace of embarrassment. "Evening classes while working full-time. Not as prestigious as some institutions, but it gave me a unique perspective on how cities and communities actually function." The CEO of a major gallery nodded approvingly. "Sometimes the most valuable insights come from unexpected places. We could use more of that thinking in our world." Madison watched helplessly as her social circle, people she'd spent years cultivating relationships with, gravitated toward Jamal like moths to a flame. His authenticity made their usual affected conversations seem shallow in comparison. "But surely," she attempted again, "the traditional gallery system has its merits." "The traditional system," Lauren cut in, still focused on Jamal, "could learn a lot from your observations about art in lived spaces. Would you be interested in consulting on our community outreach program?" The room seemed to spin slightly. Madison had been trying to get her foot in the door at the Met for months, and here was Lauren offering opportunities to her maintenance supervisor. "That's very kind," Jamal replied diplomatically, "but I'm quite committed to my current work. There's something valuable about maintaining the spaces where art and life intersect." His response, humble yet dignified, only seemed to increase his appeal. Madison watched in growing distress as Lauren handed him her business card anyway, insisting they continue the conversation later. The evening was spiraling out of her control. Every attempt she made to reassert her influence fell flat, while Jamal's natural charm and unexpected depth continued to win over her guests. The worst part was that he didn't seem to be trying to show her up. His genuine interest and insights were simply more compelling than her calculated social performances. The party was only halfway through, and Madison was already running out of ways to salvage her reputation. As she signaled for another martini, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the window. Designer dress, perfect makeup, practiced smile, and for the first time, She wondered if she was the one who didn't belong. Mark Blackwood's entrance into the conversation shifted the energy in the room. As Madison's longtime rival in both business and social circles, he had a talent for identifying weaknesses and exploiting them. Tonight, his target was clear. Jamal, Mark called out, moving through the crowd with the practiced ease of old money. His tailored Tom Ford suit and steel gray hair projected authority. I couldn't help but overhear your thoughts on urban development. Quite impressive for someone in maintenance. The slight emphasis on maintenance didn't go unnoticed. Several guests tensed, waiting to see how Jamal would respond to the subtle condescension. Mark Blackwood, Jamal acknowledged, meeting the older man's gaze steadily. Your reputation precedes you, particularly your recent development project in the Bronx. Mark's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. You're familiar with it? Very. In fact, I grew up 3 blocks from where you're planning to revitalize the neighborhood. Jamal's tone remained pleasant, but there was steel beneath the surface. I'm curious about your plans for the current residents. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Mark's controversial development projects were usually discussed in terms of profit margins, not displaced families. Madison watched the exchange with growing anxiety, sensing another disruption to her carefully planned evening. Actually, Mark recovered smoothly. That's precisely why I wanted to speak with you. We're looking for someone with local insight, someone who understands both sides of the equation. How would you feel about joining our community relations team? The offer hung in the air. Madison's breath caught. Mark was offering Jamal a position that would typically require an MBA and family connections. It was a power move designed to either buy Jamal's loyalty or expose him as an opportunist. Jamal took a slow sip of his water, letting the silence stretch just long enough to be noticeable. That's a generous offer, Mr. Blackwood, but I have to wonder, would my insight actually influence your plans, or would I just be providing better PR for decisions you've already made? A few guests gasped softly. Mark's expression hardened for a moment before he forced another smile. You're direct. I appreciate that. We could use someone with your perspective. The salary would be substantial, of course. Money isn't everything, Mr. Blackwood, Jamal replied quietly. Sometimes integrity matters more. The silence that followed was deafening. Madison watched as her guests' expressions shifted from shocked to impressed. Even Mark seemed thrown off balance and used to being challenged so elegantly in public. Well, Mark said finally, his tone less certain, the offer stands. Think about it. As Mark retreated, Madison saw her opportunity slipping away. She'd hoped Mark's intervention would expose Jamal's social climbing ambitions. Instead, his principled refusal had only elevated him further in her guest's estimation. Remarkable, she heard someone murmur. He just turned down a 6-figure job to keep his principles. And did you hear how he stood up to Mark? Without being rude, but not backing down either? Madison felt the control of her own party shifting further away. She'd planned for Jamal to embarrass himself, to prove he didn't belong in their world. Instead, he was making their world look shallow in comparison. Lauren, who had watched the entire exchange, was now deep in conversation with several board members, gesturing animatedly in Jamal's direction. Madison caught fragments of phrases like fresh perspective and exactly what we need. The tension between Madison and Jamal had evolved into something more complex than simple social warfare. Every time she tried to assert her superiority, he countered with genuine substance. His refusal of Mark's offer hadn't just been about integrity. It had exposed the transactional nature of their entire social circle. I need some air, Madison announced to no one in particular, turning toward the balcony. But before she could escape, she caught Jamal's eye across the room. For a brief moment, their gazes locked, and she saw something unexpected there. Not triumph or satisfaction, but a kind of understanding that made her even more uncomfortable. The game she'd planned to play had transformed into something else entirely, and Madison was beginning to realize she might not be the one making the rules anymore. The cool night air hit Madison's face as she stepped onto the balcony, gripping the marble railing with manicured fingers. Below, New York City sprawled out in its evening glory, a maze of lights and shadows that usually made her feel powerful. Tonight, It just reminded her how quickly things could slip out of control. She heard the glass door slide open behind her, but didn't turn around. The steady footsteps told her exactly who had followed her out. "Quite a view," Jamal said, stopping a respectful distance away. "Though I imagine it looks different to everyone who sees it." Madison let out a sharp laugh. "Let me guess. Another metaphor about perspective and privilege?" "Actually," he replied, "I was just commenting on Tage. View." His voice held no mockery, which somehow made it worse. The party continued inside, their muted voices and laughter creating a backdrop to the city's ambient noise. Madison turned to face him, her designer dress catching the wind. "Why are you here, Jamal? Really?" The question came out more vulnerable than she'd intended. "You knew this was a setup. You knew I invited you to humiliate me?" He finished calmly. "Yes, I knew." His honesty caught her off guard. "Then why come?" Jamal moved to the railing, looking out at the city. "Because sometimes the best way to challenge assumptions is to face them head on. You saw me as just the maintenance supervisor, someone you could use for entertainment. I saw an opportunity to show that worth isn't determined by social status." Madison felt her carefully constructed worldview wavering. "You make it sound so simple, but this is my world. These people, these connections, they're everything I've been raised to value." "Are they?" Jamal asked quietly. "Or are they everything you've been taught to fear losing?" The question hit too close to home. Madison turned away, blinking rapidly. "You don't understand. The pressure, the expectations, one wrong move and what? You'll end up like me?" There was no bitterness in his voice, only curiosity. "Working an honest job? Having real conversations instead of social performances?" "Stop it," Madison whispered. "You're not better than us just because you can quote art theory and turn down job offers." "I never said I was better," Jamal replied. "That's the point you're missing. I'm not trying to prove I'm better than anyone. I'm just being myself." The simplicity of his statement made Madison's throat tight. How long had it been since she'd just been herself? Without calculation, without considering the social implications of every word and gesture? "I saw your face when Lauren offered you that consulting position," Madison said, changing tactics. "You wanted it." "Of course I did," Jamal admitted. "But not at the cost of becoming someone else. Not at the cost of playing these games you're all so tired of playing." Madison turned sharply. "We're not." But she stopped, seeing the knowing look in his eyes. They both knew it was true. Inside, the party continued. Madison could see her guests through the glass, still buzzing about Jamal's exchange with Mark. Her carefully planned evening of social humiliation had transformed into something else entirely. "Why did you really invite me tonight, Madison?" Jamal asked softly. "Was it just about putting me in my place? Or was there something else? Something about proving to yourself that your world is superior?" Madison felt tears threatening to fall and blinked them back furiously. "You don't get to psychoanalyze me. You don't know me." "No," he agreed. "But I see you. The real you, not this persona you've created. And I think that's what scares you most." The wind picked up, carrying the sound of distant sirens. Madison wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly feeling exposed in her expensive dress and carefully crafted image. "The party's waiting for you," Jamal said gently, turning to go back inside. "Their hostess is missing." "Their hostess," Madison repeated quietly. "Is that all I am to them?" Jamal paused at the door. "That's up to you, isn't it?" He left her alone on the balcony, the question hanging in the air like the city lights below. Madison stood there, feeling the weight of expectations and appearances pressing down on her, while inside, the world she'd always known continued to shift beneath her feet. When Madison finally returned inside, she found the party had split into distinct camps. One group, clustered around the bar, maintained the usual social pretenses, discussing hedge funds and summer homes in the Hamptons. The other, larger group surrounded Jamal near the fireplace, engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation. "Tell us more about your grandmother," Lauren urged, perched on the edge of an antique armchair. "You mentioned she was an artist?" Madison moved closer, trying to appear casual as she listened. The usual party chatter had died down. replaced by an attentive silence she rarely witnessed at her events. She wasn't an artist in the way you're thinking, Jamal began, his voice carrying a warmth that drew people in. She cleaned offices in the Chrysler Building for 30 years. But she taught me to see beauty in everything. Even Mark had drifted closer, though he maintained a practiced expression of disinterest. Every night when she came home, Jamal continued, she'd tell me about the art she'd seen that day. Not just the paintings in the lobbies, but the way light fell through the windows, the patterns the vacuum cleaner made in the carpet, the reflection of the city in the windows she cleaned. Madison noticed several guests dabbing at their eyes. Even Blake, who usually maintained a carefully curated aloofness, looked moved. One day, when I was 12, she took me to work with her. It was against the rules, but she wanted me to see something. We went up to the 61st floor after everyone had left. The sunset was turning the whole city gold, and she said to me, "Jamal, baby, some people spend their whole lives trying to own beauty. But look, it's right here, free for anyone who takes the time to see it." The room was completely silent now. Madison felt something shift in her chest, a recognition she didn't want to acknowledge. "She passed away last year," Jamal said quietly. "But every time I walk into this building, every time I adjust the lighting on that Rothko or clean the windows in the lobby, I think about what she taught me. About how art isn't just something you hang on a wall or discuss at parties. It's about how you see the world." Lauren wiped a tear from her cheek, not caring about her mascara. That's the most beautiful perspective on art I've ever heard. "It's more than art," someone else added. "It's about life, about what we value." Madison watched as her carefully cultivated guests, people who prided themselves on emotional restraint, openly wiped their eyes and nodded in agreement. The artificial barriers of social class had crumbled, if only temporarily, in the face of genuine human connection. "My grandmother would have loved this place," Jamal continued, gesturing to the penthouse. "Not for its monetary value, but for how the space makes people feel, how it brings people together, or it could if we let it." The subtle critique wasn't lost on Madison. Her parties had always been about exclusion, about reinforcing social boundaries. Jamal had transformed this one into something else entirely. "Of course," Mark interjected, attempting to regain some control. "Appreciation is one thing, but actual ownership, is that really what matters most?" Lauren cut him off, surprising everyone with her directness. "We spend so much time talking about market values and investment potential that we forget why art matters in the first place." The room hummed with murmured agreement. Madison watched as her guests, many of whom she'd known for years, seemed to wake up from a collective trance of social performance. "Your grandmother sounds like she was a remarkable woman," Blake said, breaking his usual pattern of only addressing those in his immediate social circle. Jamal smiled, "and she would have loved meeting all of you. Not for your titles or bank accounts, but for who you are beneath all that." Madison felt the words like a physical blow. Who were they beneath all that? Who was she? The question echoed in her mind as she watched her guests respond to Jamal's story with unprecedented authenticity. The party had become something unrecognizable, not a showcase of wealth and status, but a moment of genuine human connection. And Madison, standing on the periphery, felt more like an outsider than Jamal ever had. As the evening progressed, Madison found herself drawn back into Jamal's orbit, but this time with a different purpose. The party had spread throughout the penthouse, leaving pockets of intimate conversation in its wake. She found him alone in the library, examining the spines of first editions she'd never read. "They're just for show, aren't they?" she said, surprising herself with her honesty. "Most of them anyway." Jamal turned, a leather-bound volume in his hands. Like a lot of things in this world, Madison moved to the window seat, smoothing her dress more out of habit than necessity. "How do you do it?" she asked finally. "Be so real, without worrying about the consequences?" "Who says I don't worry?" Jamal replaced the book carefully. "I just decided a long time ago that the consequences of not being authentic were worse than any social fallout." "That's easy to say when you have nothing to lose," Madison said, then immediately regretted it. Instead of taking offense, Jamal sat across from her. "Tell me, Madison, what exactly do you think you have to lose?" The question hung between them. Outside, the city lights twinkled like distant judgments. "Everything," she whispered. "My position, my friends, my family's respect. Do you know what it's like to be a Wells?" The expectation started before I could walk. Every achievement, every failure, measured against generations of success. And tonight was supposed to be another achievement? Jamal asked gently, putting the maintenance supervisor in his place. Madison felt tears threatening again. "God, it sounds so petty when you say it out loud." "It is petty," Jamal agreed, but without malice. "But I understand it. Fear makes us do petty things." "I'm not afraid," Madison protested automatically. "Aren't you?" Jamal leaned forward. "Afraid of disappointing your family? Afraid of being seen as less than perfect? Afraid that if you stop performing, people might see the real Madison Wells?" His words hit too close to home. Madison stood abruptly, pacing the Persian rug. "You don't understand. Every move I make is scrutinized. One wrong step, and it's in the society pages." Wells' heiress falls short again. "I saw those articles," Jamal said quietly. "About the gallery you tried to open last year." Madison froze. "How did you? I pay attention. It was a good idea, focusing on emerging artists from diverse backgrounds. Very different from the usual Wells investments." "It failed," Madison said bitterly. "Father made sure of that. Said it would dilute the family brand." "Is that why you stopped painting?" Madison whirled around. "How could you possibly know about that?" Jamal smiled softly. "The art supplies in your guest room closet. I found them when fixing the ventilation last month. They looked expensive and unused." "I haven't painted since college," Madison admitted, sinking back onto the window seat. "Father said it was time to stop playing around and take my position seriously." "And what position is that exactly? Social enforcer? Keeper of arbitrary boundaries? You make it sound so meaningless." "Isn't it?" Jamal challenged. "Tonight, you invited me here to reinforce those boundaries. Instead, you've watched them dissolve, and the world didn't end. Your guests aren't running away in horror because they had a genuine conversation with a maintenance supervisor." Madison laughed despite herself, a real laugh this time. "No, they're practically fighting over who gets to talk to you next. Because I'm being real with them," Jamal said. "Something they rarely experience in this world. Something you rarely experience." The truth of his words settled over them like dust in the library's dim light. Madison felt decades of careful conditioning starting to crack. "I don't know how to be real anymore," she confessed. "I'm not even sure I know who that person is." "She's the one who wanted to open a gallery for emerging artists," Jamal said. "The one who still keeps art supplies in a way, just in case. The one who's sitting here now, having an honest conversation instead of planning her next social move." Madison felt something shift inside her, like a lock finally turning. "It's terrifying," she whispered. "Growth usually is," Jamal replied. "But it's better than staying trapped in a role you've outgrown." From the main room, they could hear laughter and animated conversation. Their two worlds continuing to blend in ways Madison never thought possible. She looked at her reflection in the window, seeing past the perfect makeup and designer dress for the first time all evening. "I don't know what happens next," she admitted. "That's the beautiful part," Jamal smiled. "You get to decide." The party had reached that crucial hour when social events either wind down or transform into something more meaningful. In Madison's penthouse, the energy was building towards something unprecedented. The usual cliques had dissolved, replaced by organic conversations that crossed all social boundaries. Madison emerged from the library changed, though subtly. Perhaps only Jamal noticed how her practiced smile had softened into something more genuine. She watched as her carefully planned evening continued to evolve beyond her control. Lauren stood suddenly, tapping her glass with a silver spoon. The room quieted, all eyes turning to the Met curator. Madison tensed, years of social training alerting her to a moment that could reshape reputations. "I rarely speak at these events," Lauren began, her usual professional reserve colored by emotion. "Typically, I observe, I evaluate, I make mental notes about who's worth watching in our world." She paused, surveying the room. Tonight has changed that approach entirely. Madison felt her heart rate increase. Beside her, Jamal remained perfectly still, his presence somehow both calming and unsettling. We in the art world, Lauren continued, pride ourselves on recognizing authenticity. We can spot a fake Picasso at 20 paces. We write elaborate critiques about truth and artistic expression. She smiled wryly. Yet we've created a society that rewards artifice over authenticity. The room shifted uncomfortably. Several guests glanced at their phones, a nervous habit when confronted with uncomfortable truths. Tonight, thanks to an unexpected guest, I've been reminded of what really matters in art and in life. Lauren turned to face Jamal directly. Your perspective on art, on life, on the intersection of beauty and accessibility, it's exactly what our institution needs. Madison felt the room holding its breath. Even Mark had stopped pretending to check his stock portfolio. I'm not just offering you a consulting position, Lauren announced. I'm offering you a role on our community engagement board. We need someone who understands both worlds. The maintenance worker who sees art living and breathing in daily life, and the intellectual who can articulate that vision to others. Gasps rippled through the room. Board positions at the Met were typically reserved for major donors or established art world figures. Madison felt her world tilting on its axis. Lauren, Mark stepped forward, his tone cautioning. The board has certain traditional requirements. Traditions change, Lauren cut him off. Or they die. Look around this room, Mark. Tonight has shown us something extraordinary. While we've been chasing status and exclusivity, we've been missing the very essence of what art means to human experience. Madison watched as her guests nodded in agreement. The same people who'd come expecting to witness a social humiliation were now invested in its opposite, the elevation of the very person they'd planned to look down upon. I won't make a decision tonight, Jamal said, his voice steady. This opportunity deserves careful consideration. He glanced at Madison. And there are other factors to consider. Lauren nodded appreciatively. Your thoughtfulness only confirms my instincts about you. But let me be clear. You've done more to bridge the gap between art and community in one evening than most of our current board members have done in years. The truth of her words hung in the air. Madison felt eyes turning to her, waiting for her reaction. After all, this was her party, her territory, her world being reshaped before her eyes. Actually, Madison heard herself say, surprising everyone including herself, Jamal and I were just discussing the importance of authentic connections and art appreciation. Her voice grew stronger. Perhaps it's time for all of us to reconsider what we value and why. The room erupted in murmured conversations. Madison caught fragments of dialogue about brave new perspectives and changing times. She saw Blake typing furiously on his phone, no doubt updating their social circle about the evening's unexpected turns. Lauren raised her glass. To new perspectives, then, and to the courage to embrace them. As glasses clinked around the room, Madison felt the last vestiges of her carefully constructed evening falling away. In their place was something far more valuable, a genuine moment of transformation, not just for Jamal, but for everyone present. The true star of the evening had emerged, but not in the way Madison had planned. Instead of witnessing a social humiliation, her guests had experienced a revelation. And somewhere between her initial scheme and this moment, Madison realized she had too. The evening was winding toward its climax, but Madison felt time slowing down. The crystal champagne flute felt heavy in her hand as she stepped forward, aware that her next actions would define more than just this evening. I'd like to make a toast, she announced, her voice wavering slightly. The room quieted, faces turning toward her with curious anticipation. Some looked concerned, others intrigued, all wondering if the Wells heiress would maintain her composure or crack under the pressure of her derailed plans. Madison, Blake whispered warningly. Maybe now isn't the best, she silenced him with a look. For once, she needed to speak without calculating the social implications of every word. When I planned this evening, she began, then stopped, her rehearsed society voice failing her. She looked at Jamal, who met her gaze with quiet understanding. Taking a deep breath, she started again. The truth is, I planned this evening as a demonstration of power. Her voice cracked slightly. Several guests shifted uncomfortably and used to such direct acknowledgement of their social games. I invited Jamal here to prove something about social hierarchies and proper places. The silence in the room grew thick. Lauren watched intently, while Mark's expression darkened with recognition of his own similar tactics over the years. Instead, Madison continued, her voice strengthening, I learned something about myself. About all of us, really. She gestured to the room. We've built these beautiful cages for ourselves, haven't we? Golden and glittering, but cages nonetheless. Tears threatened to fall, but for the first time in her adult life, Madison didn't fight them. We talk about art, about beauty, about culture, but we've forgotten how to actually see it. We've forgotten how to feel it. She turned to Jamal, who stood quietly near the fireplace. You came here tonight knowing it was a trap, but instead of playing the role I assigned you, you showed us all what authenticity looks like, what courage looks like. Madison, her father's oldest friend, Richard, stepped forward with concern. Perhaps you've had too much champagne. No, she cut him off firmly. For once in my life, I'm not having enough. Not nearly enough honesty. Not nearly enough reality. She laughed, a sound caught between liberation and fear. Do you know I used to paint? Actually paint, not just collect art for investment purposes. The revelation hung in the air. Several older guests exchanged knowing. Gee looks. They remembered the young Madison, before she'd been fully molded into her current role. I stopped because it wasn't proper. Because it wasn't what a Wells does. Her voice trembled. Just like inviting maintenance supervisors to galas isn't what a Wells does. Except tonight proved that maybe we've all been doing exactly what we shouldn't be doing. She saw her words landing on her guests, saw some of them recognizing their own buried passions, their own abandoned authenticities. So this toast, she raised her glass, though her hand shook slightly, isn't to success or status or social position. It's to... She paused, searching for the right words. To new beginnings, Jamal offered quietly. Madison felt tears fall freely now. To new beginnings, she echoed, and to the courage to embrace them, even when they look nothing like what we planned. The room remained silent for a moment before Lauren stepped forward, raising her glass. Others followed, a ripple effect of crystal catching light. Even Mark, after a moment's hesitation, lifted his glass. But Madison wasn't finished. Jamal, she turned to him directly, I owe you an apology. A public one. What I planned. What I intended. Her voice failed again. What you intended, he said gently, led to something better than anyone planned. Maybe that's a lesson in itself. Madison nodded, tears still falling. I don't know how to be different, she admitted, not just to him, but to the room. I don't know how to break out of this role. Nobody's asking you to break anything, Jamal replied. Just to be real, to be yourself. And who is that? She whispered. Maybe, he suggested. That's what you get to find out next. The room absorbed this exchange in respectful silence, witnessing the unraveling of carefully constructed facades and the possibility of something more authentic emerging. Madison felt exposed, vulnerable, terrified, and somehow more alive than she had in years. The evening had become a confession, a revolution, a possibility. And as Madison lowered her glass, she realized that while she had lost the game she'd intended to play, she might have gained something far more valuable in return. The evening seemed to be drawing to its natural conclusion when Alexander Chin stood up. Few had noticed the quiet man in the corner, observing everything with keen eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. As he moved to the center of the room, something in his demeanor commanded attention. Fascinating evening, he said, his voice carrying easily across the now silent room. I must say, when my friend Lauren invited me, I didn't expect such authenticity. Madison felt a chill run down her spine. Alexander Chin. The name suddenly clicked into place. The reclusive billionaire investor known for backing transformative cultural projects. I've been watching this unfold, he continued, this unexpected collision of worlds, and it's made me think about a project I've been considering. He turned to face Madison directly, one that, ironically, involves your father's latest development plans. The room collectively held its breath. Madison's father, though not present, was a looming figure in their world. His real estate developments had reshaped entire neighborhoods, not always for the better. "What do you know about my father's plans?" Madison asked, her voice barely steady. "I know he's planning to demolish an entire arts district to build luxury condominiums," Chin stated flatly, including, coincidentally, the community center where Jamal teaches evening art classes to local kids. The revelation hit the room like a thunderbolt. Madison turned to Jamal, who met her gaze steadily. "You never mentioned," she started. "It wasn't relevant to tonight," Jamal replied quietly. "Or maybe it was more relevant than any of us knew." Chun moved closer, his presence somehow both gentle and commanding. "I've been looking for the right project to launch my new cultural reservation initiative, something that bridges the gap between high art and community access. Tonight, watching this unexpected social experiment unfold, I realized I'd found it." Mark stepped forward, sensing opportunity. "Alexander, if you're looking for investment partners, I'm not." Chin cut him off smoothly. "I'm looking for authenticity, for people who understand both worlds and can help bridge them." He looked between Madison and Jamal. People who might, despite their differences, work together to create something revolutionary. Madison felt the world shifting beneath her feet. "What exactly are you proposing?" "A partnership," Chin replied, "but not the kind your father would recognize. I'm prepared to buy the arts district, not to demolish it, but to transform it into a living museum. A space where high art meets community access, where maintenance workers and Met curators can collaborate, where authentic expression matters more than social status." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But I need the right people to lead it. People who understand both sides of the divide. People who've shown they can bridge it." Lauren stepped forward, excitement breaking through her professional reserve. "Alexander, are you suggesting—" "I'm suggesting," he said carefully, "that tonight's failed attempt at social humiliation might have accidentally revealed exactly what the art world needs. A partnership between someone who understands elite cultural institutions," he nodded to Madison, "and someone who understands community engagement and authentic appreciation," he turned to Jamal. The silence in the room was electric. "Of course," Chin added with a slight smile. "This would mean going against your father's plans, Madison. It would mean choosing a different path than the one laid out for you. It would mean risking everything you thought was important for something that actually is." Madison felt tears threatening again, but this time they were different. These were tears of possibility, of liberation. "The gallery I wanted to open," she said softly, then stronger, "the one my father shut down. It was going to focus on emerging artists from diverse backgrounds." "I know," Chin nodded. "I did my research, just as I researched Jamal's community art programs. Sometimes the right partners are just waiting to find each other, even if they meet under unusual circumstances." Madison looked at Jamal, seeing him truly for the first time, not as a maintenance supervisor, not as a social experiment, but as a potential partner in something meaningful. "Well," she said, managing a genuine smile through her tears, "I did say this was a toast to new beginnings." The room erupted in applause, led by Lauren and echoed even by Mark, who knew when to join the winning side. But Madison barely heard it. She was looking at Jamal, who smiled back with understanding. The evening had begun as an attempt to reinforce social boundaries. It was ending with those boundaries not just crossed, but transformed into bridges. And somewhere in between, Madison had found something she didn't even know she was looking for: the courage to be herself. To new beginnings, Jamal raised his glass one final time. To authenticity, Madison added. And as the New York skyline twinkled beyond the windows, the future seemed to hold possibilities neither of them had imagined when the evening began.